The year is 1990. In the heart of Quebec, a small town called Oka becomes the epicenter of a conflict that will forever change the course of Canadian history. The Oka Crisis, as it came to be known, was a 78-day standoff between the Mohawk people of Kanesatake and the Canadian government. At stake was more than just a piece of land. It was a battle for Indigenous rights, a struggle for recognition, and a fight against centuries of injustice. The crisis erupted on July 11th when the Quebec Provincial Police attempted to dismantle a Mohawk blockade erected to protect their ancestral land. The Mohawk people, determined to protect their heritage, stood their ground. The situation escalated quickly, leading to a tense standoff that would capture the attention of the nation and expose the deep-seated tensions between Indigenous communities and the Canadian government. The Oka Crisis was a watershed moment in Canadian history. It brought the issue of Indigenous land claims to the forefront of national consciousness, forcing Canadians to confront the uncomfortable truths of their colonial past. The events of that summer revealed the systemic racism and discrimination faced by Indigenous peoples and sparked a national conversation about reconciliation and justice that continues to this day. At the heart of the Oka Crisis lay a fundamental disagreement. Who had the right to a parcel of land known as the Pines? For the Mohawk people of Kanesatake, the answer was clear. This land, encompassing a pine forest and a burial ground, was an integral part of their ancestral territory, a place of deep cultural and spiritual significance. They had lived on and cared for this land for centuries, their connection to it running far deeper than any legal document. However, the town of Oka saw things differently. They had their own plans for the Pines, intending to expand a golf course and develop luxury housing on the disputed territory. This decision, made without meaningful consultation with the Mohawk people, ignited a firestorm of protest. The Mohawk community saw this development as a desecration of their sacred land, a continuation of the colonial policies that had dispossessed them for generations. For the Mohawk, the proposed development was not merely an inconvenience. It was the latest chapter in a long and painful history of land dispossession. Since the arrival of European settlers, they had witnessed their traditional territory steadily eroded, their claims to their land ignored and dismissed. The Oka Crisis, therefore, was not simply about a golf course or housing development. It was about the survival of their culture, their identity, and their connection to their ancestral home. The Mohawk people had attempted to resolve this land dispute through legal channels for years, filing petitions and launching court challenges, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The Canadian government, despite its stated commitment to reconciliation, seemed unwilling or unable to address the historical injustices faced by Indigenous communities. The stage was set for confrontation, for a clash between two worldviews, two ways of life, and two fundamentally different understandings of the meaning of land. To understand the Oka Crisis, delve into the troubled history of Indigenous settler relations in Canada. The Mohawk people have endured centuries of broken promises, forced assimilation, and dispossession of their lands. The seeds of the Oka conflict were sown long before 1990, rooted in a colonial past. Treaties, often signed under duress, justified the seizure of Indigenous lands. The Oka Crisis was the culmination of centuries of grievances and systemic discrimination. The Pines held profound cultural and spiritual significance for the Mohawk people of Kanesatake. It was a living link to their ancestors, a place where history, spirituality, and identity intertwined. The proposed golf course expansion represented a desecration of their sacred ground. The Mohawk community watched in dismay as trees were felled and survey markers appeared. The Oka Crisis was about defending their heritage, spirituality, and right to exist as a distinct people. The Mohawk people of Kanesatake had not been silent about the proposed development at the Pines. For years, they voiced opposition through legal channels, petitions, and appeals. Their case was meticulously documented with historical records, maps, and oral testimonies, yet their efforts were met with indifference and delay. The Canadian legal system failed to uphold Indigenous land rights, treaties were misinterpreted, and historical injustices ignored. The Mohawk people were trapped in a bureaucratic labyrinth. The town of Oka pushed forward with its development plans. The town council argued they had followed proper legal procedures. They viewed the Mohawk opposition as an obstacle. Tensions began to rise as their pleas were dismissed. They exhausted all peaceful avenues for redress. The proposed desecration of their sacred land was a line they could not allow to be crossed. The stage was set for confrontation, a clash of values and understandings of land and justice. By the spring of 1990, the Mohawk people of Kanesatake had reached a breaking point. The town of Oka planned to expand the golf course onto the sacred grounds of the Pines. Construction crews were preparing to break ground. The Mohawk community knew they had to take a stand. On July 11, 1990, Mohawk warriors erected a barricade. This act marked the beginning of the Oka Crisis. The barricade represented a line in the sand. The mood was tense but resolute. Mohawk warriors were prepared to defend their land. They were joined by community members, elders, women and children. The air was thick with anticipation. The Mohawk people understood the gravity of their actions. They knew their stand could lead to confrontation. They had a responsibility to their ancestors and future generations. The barricade was an act of love, defending their heritage and identity. The Oka barricade began with a tense calm, a standoff between Mohawk warriors and the Quebec provincial police. The Mohawk community, united and determined, sought dialogue and a just resolution to their land dispute. The police presence highlighted the power dynamics at play. The air crackled with tension, punctuated by the chirping of birds. They organized shifts, prepared meals, and maintained the barricade. Children played among makeshift shelters. Elders offered guidance and prayers. The community found strength in their shared heritage and belief in their cause. The Oka barricade became a vibrant hub of resistance, showcasing the resilience of the Mohawk people. Tents and shelters sprang up, providing refuge and solidarity. Donations poured in, a tangible expression of support. Traditional ceremonies and stories strengthened their resolve. The Mohawk people remained steadfast, their struggle a symbol of resistance. The uneasy peace over Oka was shattered in the pre-dawn hours of July 11, 1990. The Quebec Provincial Police launched a surprise raid on the Mohawk barricade. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, a heavily armed contingent of SQ officers advanced on the Mohawk barricade. The Mohawk people, however, had anticipated such an attack and were prepared to defend their land. The initial volley of tear gas canisters sent shockwaves through the encampment. Women and children, caught in the crossfire, screamed in terror, seeking refuge. The Mohawk warriors, their faces hardened with determination, returned fire, signaling the start of a desperate struggle. The SQ, expecting a swift victory, were met with fierce resistance. The element of surprise lost, the raid quickly descended into chaos. The events of that morning would leave an indelible mark on the Oka Crisis, transforming a tense standoff into a full-blown armed conflict. As the sun rose higher, the fighting at the Oka barricade intensified. The Mohawk warriors, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. In the midst of the chaos, a tragic event occurred that would forever alter the course of the Oka Crisis. Corporal Marcel Lemay, a member of the SQ, was fatally shot. The circumstances surrounding his death remain murky, with conflicting accounts from both sides. The death of Corporal Lemay sent shockwaves through the nation. The Canadian public reacted with shock and outrage. The death of Corporal Lemay had a profound impact on the dynamics of the Oka Crisis. It hardened the resolve of both sides, making a peaceful resolution seem increasingly unlikely. The stage was set for a protracted and increasingly dangerous standoff. The death of Corporal Lemay and the escalating violence at Oka sent shockwaves through the Canadian government. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney decided to deploy the Canadian Armed Forces. The arrival of the military marked a significant escalation of the conflict. Thousands of soldiers, equipped with armored personnel carriers, tanks and helicopters, descended upon Oka. the Mohawk territory was effectively placed under siege. The Mohawk people, though outnumbered and outgunned, refused to back down. The warriors, their numbers bolstered by indigenous allies, reinforced their defenses. The deployment of the military had far-reaching consequences for the Oka Crisis. It internationalized the conflict, drawing attention to the plight of indigenous peoples in Canada. The Oka Crisis had become a national referendum on the very nature of Canada's relationship with its indigenous peoples. The events at Oka were now beamed into living rooms across Canada and around the world. The Oka Crisis had become a media spectacle, sparking heated debates about Indigenous rights and government policy. The media coverage of the Oka Crisis was often fraught with bias and misinformation. Many news outlets portrayed the Mohawk people as the aggressors. The Mohawk people struggled to have their voices heard amidst the media frenzy. They spoke of their deep connection to the land and their frustration with the government's inaction. The media coverage of the Oka Crisis had a profound impact on public opinion. It reinforced existing prejudices and stereotypes about Indigenous peoples. The Mohawk people were now increasingly seen as a threat. The Oka Crisis exposed the deep divisions within Canadian society. As the standoff at Oka dragged on, it became a rallying cry for Indigenous peoples across Canada. First Nations communities saw in the Mohawk struggle a reflection of their own experiences. The Oka Crisis also exposed the deep divisions within Canadian society. While many Canadians sympathized with the Mohawk people's plight, others viewed their actions as unlawful. The town of Oka became a microcosm of the nation's divisions. Protests and counter-protests erupted, pitting neighbor against neighbor. The Oka Crisis became a lightning rod for long-simmering tensions over land claims and treaty rights. It forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about their history and their relationship with Indigenous peoples. The crisis revealed the limits of reconciliation. Oka was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that Canada's journey towards healing and justice for Indigenous peoples was far from over. The Oka Crisis captured the attention of international media and human rights organizations. The world watched as Canada grappled with a crisis that exposed deep-seated inequalities. Human rights observers expressed concerns about the use of force against the Mohawk people. The Canadian government defended its actions, arguing that it was acting to uphold the law. The Oka Crisis challenged Canada's international reputation. It highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation that preached peace while deploying its military against its own Indigenous population. The crisis underscored the need for Canada to address its own internal conflicts. The Oka Crisis demonstrated the limitations of reconciliation in the absence of concrete action. The Canadian government had made symbolic gestures towards reconciliation but failed to address the root causes of the conflict. The Oka Crisis served as a stark reminder that true reconciliation requires more than words. The Canadian government's response to the Oka Crisis was characterized by a massive deployment of military force. Thousands of soldiers, armed with sophisticated weaponry, descended upon the small Mohawk community. The roar of tanks and armored vehicles replaced the tranquil sounds of nature. The Mohawk people watched in disbelief and anger as their community was effectively placed under siege. The presence of the military only strengthened their resolve to resist. The sight of Canadian soldiers patrolling the streets served as a constant reminder of the colonial history. The militarization of Oka had a profound psychological impact on the Mohawk people. The constant presence of soldiers created an atmosphere of fear and anxiety. The community was now transformed into a pressure cooker of tension and uncertainty. The government justified its actions by emphasizing the need to restore order and uphold the rule of law. As the Oka Crisis stretched into weeks, the Mohawk community found themselves living under a suffocating siege. The delivery of essential supplies was severely restricted, creating shortages and hardships. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance took a heavy toll on the community's morale. The Mohawk people, however, refused to be broken by the hardships. Elders shared stories of resilience and resistance, reminding the younger generation of their proud history. Women played a vital role in maintaining morale, organizing community kitchens, and caring for the children. The Mohawk people also found solace in their spirituality, holding traditional ceremonies and prayers. The sacred fire became a symbol of their unwavering spirit. Despite the fear and uncertainty, the Mohawk people found ways to laugh, sing, and celebrate their culture. The Oka Crisis revealed the indomitable spirit of a people fighting for their very survival. The Oka Crisis, unfolding in the full glare of the media spotlight, became a battleground not just for land and rights, but also for public opinion. The way the crisis was portrayed in the media, particularly in the early days, had a profound impact on how the conflict was perceived by the Canadian public and the international community. Unfortunately, much of the coverage was characterized by bias, misinformation, and a failure to provide the historical context necessary to understand the root causes of the conflict. Many media outlets, reflecting the prevailing societal attitudes of the time, resorted to stereotypes and generalizations in their portrayal of the Mohawk people. The warriors, defending their land with hunting rifles and traditional weapons, were often depicted as aggressive militants, a threat to public order. The historical grievances, the broken treaties, the systemic discrimination that had led to the crisis were often minimized or ignored, perpetuating the myth that the Mohawk people were unreasonable troublemakers. This biased coverage had a significant impact on public perception, fueling fear and resentment towards the Mohawk people, particularly among those directly affected by the blockades and disruptions caused by the crisis. The Mohawk people, struggling to have their voices heard amidst the media frenzy, found themselves battling not only the Canadian government, but also a wave of negative public opinion that painted them as the villains in a conflict they did not start. The Oka Crisis exposed the power of the media to shape public perception and influence the course of events. It also highlighted the importance of media literacy, the need for critical thinking and analysis when consuming news coverage, especially when it comes to complex issues like Indigenous rights and reconciliation. The 78-day standoff at Oka ended, but the core issues remained unresolved. The Mohawk warriors disarmed, not in surrender but as a strategic retreat. The land, the pines, stayed under military control, symbolizing unresolved tensions. The golf course project was abandoned, a small victory for the Mohawk people, yet their broader land claims remained unresolved. The Canadian government offered piecemeal solutions, avoiding meaningful dialogue. The Mohawk people returned, bearing the scars of the conflict. The Oka Crisis highlighted the limitations of the Canadian legal system. The courts often failed to uphold Indigenous rights bound by colonial precedents. The Mohawk, like many First Nations, faced bureaucratic delays and political maneuvering. The Oka Crisis was a catalyst for change in Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. The standoff forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about their colonial past. It sparked a national conversation about Indigenous rights and reconciliation. The crisis led to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, examining systemic discrimination. The RCAP report called for restructuring the relationship based on mutual respect. The Oka Crisis inspired a new generation of Indigenous activists and leaders. Indigenous communities began to assert their rights with greater determination. The crisis marked a turning point in Indigenous settler relations in Canada. More than 3 decades after the Oka Crisis, its legacy continues to shape Canada's relationship with its Indigenous peoples. The events of that summer serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace, the persistence of injustice, and the urgent need for reconciliation based on mutual respect, understanding, and a willingness to address the root causes of conflict. The Oka Crisis taught Canadians that ignoring Indigenous rights and aspirations is not a viable path forward. It exposed the deep divisions within Canadian society, the chasm of understanding and empathy that separated Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The crisis highlighted the need for Canadians to educate themselves about Indigenous history, cultures, and perspectives, to challenge their own biases and assumptions, and to engage in meaningful dialogue about the future of their shared country. The Oka Crisis also underscored the importance of Indigenous self-determination, the right of Indigenous peoples to govern their own affairs, to control their own lands and resources, and to determine their own destinies. The crisis demonstrated that true reconciliation cannot be imposed from above but must be built from the ground up through respectful dialogue, meaningful partnerships, and a willingness to share power. The legacy of Oka is a complex one, marked by both pain and progress. It is a story of resistance and resilience, of courage in the face of adversity, and of the enduring human spirit. It is also a story of missed opportunities, broken promises, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. As Canada moves forward on its journey of reconciliation, the lessons of Oka must not be forgotten. The crisis serves as a powerful reminder that true reconciliation requires more than just words. It demands concrete action, a fundamental shift in power dynamics, and a commitment to building a future where all Canadians can live together in peace, respect, and mutual understanding.